One of the most important things you can do to prevent weed resistance or disease resistance or insect resistance is to rotate chemical families. Now, the problem is sometimes two different chemical families might have the same mode of action, and more importantly, they might have the same site of action. What we really want you to do is rotate sites of action. So today we wanted to explain, first of all, what's the difference between sites of action, mode of action, chemical family, but then also talk about why you need to rotate, what some of your options are, especially with Roundup resistant weeds.
Well, it just seems like yesterday we were watching football games. Now football season is over, Brian, and I just think about it the same way with killing a weed and stopping a running back. For example, I'm a Minnesota Vikings fan, and I'm thinking about how do other teams try to stop Adrian Peterson? Well, let's say you have two defenders. They're both going to try and tackle him at the same time, and they both like to go for the ankles. Well, Adrian Peterson just jumps over them and runs for a touchdown. Let's say that both guys want to go for his knees. Maybe he does a juke move and gets around them and goes for a touchdown. But if you have one defender that goes for his legs and one defender that tackles him above the waist, now all of a sudden, how is he going to avoid that? He can't. And it's the same thing with weeds. If you have two different herbicides that you say, well, I'm going to use this one pre-emerge and that one post-emerge, or I'm going to tank mix them together and go with two modes of action out there to control this tough weed. Well, if they're both hitting that weed in the same spot, it's real easy for a weed to develop resistance in just one site of action. But if you have multiple sites of action, so you're hitting the weed high and you're hitting the weed low, now all of a sudden you've got a much better chance of getting control.
That's an interesting analogy there, Darren, but here's what I really wanted to get to.
Well, I just was hoping for more Vikings wins this year, so I'm going to do everything I can to try and drum that up for next year.
All right, we'll see if that can happen. But here's the whole thing. When we're talking about chemical families, it's chemicals that are very similar to each other. Okay, and I think that's fairly easy to understand that you've got, let's say, Treflan and Sonalan that are in the same chemical family. They're both DNAs. They both have a very similar makeup to the products. Okay, then in terms of the mode of action, that's in a particular way that it's going to kill the plant. But here's the whole thing. It's not just the way it kills the plant. We want to know exactly what site is it actually stopping inside the plant. That's what counts the most. And sometimes we can have two modes of action that actually work on the exact same site, and that is going to be a problem if we're trying to prevent disease resistance or weed resistance or insect resistance.
Well, and like you say, just rotating between families is one thing. Also, once you've used one site of action, it's a good idea to focus on using a different site of action later. So when we're talking about weed control, I think soybeans is probably the crop on our farm where it gets to be the most challenging because we've seen more broadleaves develop resistance to certain chemistries, whether it's the ALS inhibitors or whether it's Roundup. We've just got a number of different chemistries that have been rendered less effective or ineffective. So if we're using one of those families or sites of action as a pre-emerge herbicide, it's a good idea to use something else post. So on our farm, like in soybeans, we'll just look at all the options that we have for post-emerge products, and we try not to use any of those pre, because there are some good options that we can use pre-emerge that can't be used post. So why limit ourselves by taking some of our best post options and using them pre, because we don't want to use them twice within a year, because we don't want to just increase our chance of building more resistance.
To help keep this simple, what the chemical companies have done is they've started putting right on the top of their label what site of action this really is. So the number might be a number 1 or a 2 or a 29 or whatever it is. The point is that you look for that number and make sure that if you want to have rotation of products on your farm, that you're picking different numbers when you're spraying these different products at the different times.
But it's just important that you think about the sites of action that you're using on your farm and trying to use multiple sites of action in every crop, every season. That way you greatly reduce your chance of having problems with resistance from weeds, insects, or diseases on your farm.
Well, our Weed of the Week does have an issue with resistance to multiple chemical families. Can you identify this week's weed?